Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Hope you're having a great day. I haven't read quotes in a while, so I was looking through my digital history book this morning, thinking about my recent conversation with my friend Steve Azar, who lives in Greenville. And, every now and then he and I will talk about the history of Jim Henson and the Muppets and, how important he is to the state of Mississippi. But I came across a quote. It was it was observing Muppets creator Jim Henson being born in 1936. And the quote was really good. I could really relate to it, especially in retirement, to be able to find a show like this on SuperTalk Mississippi that really enables me to do what I really loved doing as a publisher, and that is connecting with the community and trying to make a difference in my small way. I felt like if I wasn't able to make a difference, I wouldn't be sitting here, because I'm not going to waste my time or yours. I'm going to be passionate and enthusiastic about what I do in this show. And the moment I believe it's not making a difference, I'm going to go back to retirement. So what Jim Henson said was this: follow your enthusiasm. It's something I've always believed in. Find those parts of your life you enjoy the most. Do what you enjoy doing. I always loved that. I mean, someone said to me, find what you love, do what you love, and it will never be a job. I've always had passion about my opportunities as a CEO of media companies to be able to do something to give back to the community. I've always volunteered an enormous amount of my time in the community. And in an interesting way, the passion I have for this show, the passion I have for having these deep conversations with people, for me has been, I probably get a lot more from it than the listeners get, but the accumulation of all of these conversations have really inspired me. And it's one of the reasons why I ultimately decided to write a book about hope. And, of course, I mentioned it from time to time that I'm writing that book. In fact, it's finished. We're just working on the editing now, but there's so much to learn when you open your mind and your heart and you have deep conversations with people. And I'm enthusiastic about that. I love doing it. And I'm honored that SuperTalk has given me an opportunity to have these conversations. I want to mention one other quick thing. I've continued to write about the need to create a Coastal Mississippi Economic Development Alliance. And one of the unique things about this show is I have the opportunity to develop relationships with people, trusting relationships with people from all walks of life, particularly in the various elements of economic development. This could be an economic development organization or people who are tied to that in some way, who are needed when potential projects are thought about and they're developing. How are we going to present our case to potential future major industries and others who might want to come here? Hey, and we're not even to the point of having the kind of conversations we need to have to be proactive and build mega sites and all of that. But I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to write about this or just mull it over. I'm gonna continue to think about it, but what I learned is that as I've referred to Coastal Mississippi in the past, for someone who's coming in from the outside, 22 different political subdivisions, 3 different economic development organizations. You got 3 ports, 3 airports, all these different entities that are involved in economic development. It's a jigsaw puzzle for someone who wants to come in from the outside. They don't see all these differences and all this division. They see Coastal Mississippi. And we don't do a good job of coming together, getting aligned, and focusing on how to present Coastal Mississippi's case to major potential projects that might want to come here. And we've got to do better. But I keep learning things that show us that we're disconnected in pretty dramatic ways. There's even some infighting that takes place in Coastal Mississippi around economic development. And so, I'm concerned about it. I'm still just trying to decide what my next step's going to be. I've written 7 columns about it. I've done even more that maybe one day I'll tell you more that I've done as it relates to that. But it's something we better focus on because it is a major issue for us. It is. I think with 78,000 direct and indirect jobs focused in gaming and government, we better diversify our economy or we are going to regret it. We've got to get focused on that. So I'll say more in the future, but just that was on my mind. Today is going to be a fascinating conversation. We're going to be visiting with Andy Chapman. He grew up in Starkville. He lives in Ocean Springs now, and he's literally coming to us as we speak from India. He is in India as we speak. He spent almost 2 months there last year. He's a world traveler, and his specialty is pecans. And you're going to say, what in the world would someone whose specialty is pecans, how would that lead them all over the world? There's a fascinating history about coastal Mississippi, especially Ocean Springs, as it relates to pecans. There's a great history of pecans in general. But Andy's gonna work with us to tell his complete story, and you're gonna learn more about him. But he's the founder and CEO of Prime Pecan and Feast Global, and he's going to be joining us for the full show today. I look forward to getting to know him. Andy, how are you doing?
Man, I'm doing good, Ricky. It's about 9. It's late in the evening here. Just finished dinner.
Well, good for you, man. By the way, I love Indian food. I was working on a major corporate project, and one of the guys who worked on the project was of Indian heritage. So when we traveled to new, big cities, because we spent most of our time in places like Miami and Philadelphia and Chicago, and places like that, we would always, at least pretty regularly, locate the Indian restaurant in the area and go there. And it was often kind of away from the beaten path. And gosh, it was so amazing. I remember it being spicy. That's what I remember about some of the dishes that we ate. But you've had an opportunity to really get a taste of that, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. I've gotten every day pretty much for the last 3 weeks. I've eaten some sort of Indian food, but I do have a hack. I eat eggs Benedict, bacon, and a croissant in the morning every time, because that way it's kind of a reset primer coat for the system before you go be adventurous later in the day.
And you're right about flavor for sure. Listen, we're gonna tell your story in great detail, but before we get there, if you're just giving the elevator speech to somebody about what you do these days, how do you talk about it?
I pretty much tell folks that after working around the pecan industry for the last 10 years, doing promotions globally and other things domestically, that we started a pecan company because people weren't getting great pecans internationally. And we figured out how we could change that. And that's what was the genesis of this whole thing. Was I'd shown these pecans to dozens, hundreds by the time it was, by the time we started, people who said, okay, well, I've seen this pecan you're showing me in my market. That's not what we get. How do we do it?
And that's so interesting. So, again, what brought you there now is, the number that really got my attention is that you were there to meet 16,000 pounds of pecans that landed in India. You're in it on a big scale, aren't you?
Yes, the foreign buyers typically buy in full container loads, which is between 20 pallets, give or take, and they're not quite 2,000 pounds on a pallet. I wish they were, but so a 40-foot container could be up to 44,000 pounds, and so that's a lot of pecans. And they buy them in a 30-pound box, and then there's 1,000 things they want to do with them, from candying, ice cream companies to, just snack mixes, bars, hotels, restaurants. I mean, you name it. There's somebody somewhere we've met and talked to about the pecan.
And what's interesting is that you found and we're going to come back to this in a second, but you found a competitive advantage around delivering fresh, really high quality pecans. I mean, like they can get frozen pecans and almost dehydrated pecans from other places. But what you have found is a place and a demand for really fresh pecans. And you've built a business around it, which I'm so fascinated with. Well, what we're going to do, we're coming to the end of this segment. When we come back on the other side, Andy actually grew up in Starkville. He didn't come to the coast until he was like 20 years old. He lives in Ocean Springs today, but we're going to talk a little bit about that journey. He mentioned that he had been in marketing pecans for around 10 years and started this business just 3 years ago. And it's taken him all over the world. It's going to be a fascinating story. I also want to talk a little bit about that history of, Ocean Springs has a kind of a special place, particularly in the World's Fair at one point as it relates to pecan quality. But when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Andy Chapman, the founder and CEO of Prime Pecan and Feast Global, coming to us from India. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. I have Andy Chapman. He's the founder and CEO of Prime Pecan and Feast Global. He lives in Ocean Springs, grew up in Starkville. We're going to hear that whole story here in just a second, but he's coming to us live from India as we speak, where he went there to sort of meet up with 16,000 pounds of pecans that landed in India. And we're going to tell the whole story. It's fascinating. I'm fascinated by it. One of the cool things about this show is we get to find people like Andy and tell their story. It's also inspiring. It's a great business story on top of just the interesting aspects of it, being in this global pecan company. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second, Andy. You grew up in Starkville. Tell me about that and sort of what did you see yourself doing when you grew up?
Well, I'm one of 7 kids, and I'm the middle. So I had 3 older siblings, 3 younger siblings. I still have 3 older siblings, 3 younger siblings to be exact. But growing up in Starkville, we were poor to the point that if we went to McDonald's, which wasn't often, my mom would say, "Cannot get a cheeseburger, only a water." We were tight. But I think we cooked at home all the time, and we had lots of friends coming over. I had more fun in the yard with a pile of dirt and a screwdriver than most people know what to do with their fancy remote controlled cars. Like we had a very fun, vibrant growing up time. And my older brother, Jeremy, went to Mississippi State. He was still at Mississippi State when I was in high school. And the next brother left and went on the Air Force, and I was like, I don't want to do that. But he had gone to Mississippi State, started in turf grass, and then switched to business information systems. And I thought, well, I'm pretty good with computers, and I like numbers and, to a certain extent, spreadsheets and all that sort of thing. And I could really hang with technology. And a lot of people didn't do that. My dad was a computer programmer. So I grew up around computers in the late 80s and early 90s. And so when my brother did that major, I thought, oh, well, that's neat. And I started talking to some of his professors, and it looked like if you were in tech in the late 90s, I graduated from high school in 97. So it was like the beginning of the tech boom. It was like, if you want to go to the moon, get in that world. And I thought, okay, well, I can be good at that, and I'll do it, and graduated from Mississippi State the December right after September 11th. And so you can imagine all of the tech companies that pulled back, some folded, some, were just like, we're not hiring anybody for a while. And that kind of left me becoming an entrepreneur very quickly. And I'd already worked for a lot of different companies in college, and knew how to build websites and databases because that's what I paid Mississippi State to teach me. And so I started a company, hung a shingle out, started building websites, and moved to a little town called Louisville, Mississippi, one of the sweetest towns in the world. And that town, everybody needed a website because nobody had one. Maybe Taylor Machine Works, a couple other people had one. But for the most part, websites were brand new. And so I was building websites and databases and traveling around Mississippi, figuring out how to solve people's problems with technology. And it was fascinating. I got to learn a lot from some of the companies that they said, hey, can you help us solve this problem? And I'm like, I've never actually done that. So let's see what we can do. And so we put our heads together and we would solve problems with technology. And, I don't consider myself a super programmer or technologist, but understanding there's a problem and how to get it solved, and looking at things from a kind of outside perspective and listening a lot to the customers and all the stakeholders kind of helped me in that process. And that led me to doing a lot of marketing, because everybody would say, I need a website, but I would ask them, okay, well, do you have your logo and all of that? And they said, well, we don't really have a logo. So then I had to start backwards and do a logo and figure out what their brand was, because maybe it had been something that had been photocopied 100 times in some of the businesses we worked with. And so we started figuring out branding and marketing. I started listening and soaking up every bit of marketing information, reading books, and then social media came along. And that's when I got on Facebook in 2005. And it was because my littlest sister was still at Mississippi State, and I wanted to check on what she was up to. And so I had been on Facebook for a couple years when I moved to Jackson in, I think it was 2008 or so. And there was a guy named Jeff Good, who, Jeff, if you're listening, I'm going to tell the story, buddy. He was sending emails to me and 1,000 other people, blind carbon copied, about every wine dinner and every sort of marketing thing they would do, which is a violation of federal law. You can't spam people. They have to have an unsubscribe link. So I reached out to Jeff on Facebook and I said, hey, can we have lunch? And of course, if anybody knows Jeff Good, he's all about that. And he's had lunch with thousands of people, bought their lunch. And I think we had coffee or lunch, met him at Broad Street. And I said, hey, I actually have a software solution where you could let people say, stop sending me these emails if they want, but also if they want to get your emails, they can go to your website and sign up. He was like, oh, so it was kind of like MailChimp or Constant Contact before those were even popular. Jeff said, okay, let's go. And I said, well, I think you should get on Facebook with your companies. And he said, Andy, I don't know. I think you should get on Twitter with your companies. And Instagram wasn't even really a thing. And Jeff said, all right, we'll talk about it. And next thing you know, we started doing some work for his restaurant group and many other restaurants at the same time in Jackson. But at the same time, I didn't know a lot about food, and I'm having to talk about it and help them market food from all these fancy restaurants that I couldn't afford to go to growing up, for sure. And I started a blog called Eat Jackson. And at one point, Eat Jackson, we were on Twitter, we were on Instagram, Facebook, and we would go out to eat around the Jackson area and do kind of I would call it just a redneck review of the place, right? I'm not some hoity-toity New York foods writer who's knows all the fancy words. I can tell you what it is. And people like Jeff and Robert St. John and many others invited me in and would tell me about the food. And I remember Robert St. John telling me about a sous vide pork chop. And I was like, a sous vide what? But sous vide actually means under vacuum in French. And so I learned about cuisine. And then many of the chefs said, hey, why don't you come back here? Let me show you how to do this. Let me show you how to do that. We started cooking at events. And I got really deep in food, which I've always loved food. But I kind of got a culinary education from Mississippi, and then it turned into regionally some of the finest chefs in the Southeast, and even a couple in New York that we did events with, and would do pop-up dinners, and really just told the story of food. And that really ties into the pecan world, because I sat down with 4 or 5 buyers of pecans in the last 3 or 4 days, and I said, you are only as good as the raw materials that you have to work with in the culinary world. So if you have a 10-day-old fish, what can you do with it? If you have a fresh piece of tuna, a shrimp straight off the boat, you can do 1,000 things. But if you have an old rancid pecan, if you have an old piece of fish, man, you better hide it. You better smother it with something. You better put a lot of sugar on it. You better do something. And so that work in the culinary world, we started doing restaurant weeks. And, if we talked about a restaurant, it would blow up. The burger that we talked about when Mint and Julep had their restaurants going, we would talk about a specific dish and it would start selling like hotcakes. So it was quite a ride. I put on a little bit of weight doing that, but man, it was fun and seeing kind of how the sausage was made from inside of all these restaurants around the Southeast. And this is right when Food Network and all those things were blowing up really big. And it was a kind of a wild journey through that time running Eat Jackson.
Yeah, hey, we're gonna shift gears when we get back on the other side and talk about the evolution into the pecan business. But it's interesting your evolution around technology. As you were talking, I was involved in some major corporate projects in the late 1990s as Oracle databases became real, and we began to deploy those across the company to create massive, centralization efforts around, what financial and otherwise. It was a really dynamic time in corporate business. But what's interesting is you continue to learn about websites and whatever. Ultimately, what you were learning all these tools, but what you were really doing is learning about marketing, understanding about what brand really means, brand being the promise that a business makes and them coming to grips with what that's all about. Going through that process makes them a better business. And you ultimately were just consulting with them, using the accumulation of information and experience to make them a better business. And then ultimately you just leveraged all of that into building your pecan company. It's really interesting the way that evolved. When we come back on the other side, we're going to continue our conversation with Andy Chapman. What a fascinating business story this is, the evolution of his, business skill sets. But it's also a great story about pecans, which we'll get into before this conversation is over with. So when we get back, we'll continue our conversation with Andy Chapman. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show. We're visiting with Andy Chapman. He's the founder and CEO of Prime Pecan and Feast Global, coming to us from India. He lives in Ocean Springs, grew up in Starkville. And as you were hearing during the last segment, his evolution has been interesting. You find a lot of entrepreneurs do kind of start one path and then it evolves through all this experience to become something else. But at the core is something unique. So while Andy Chapman may have built a pecan company, what he has really built is sort of this international marketing company that enables him to use the pecan as the way he grows his business. And it's a great story. It's a great sort of competitive advantage he's created. It will be interesting to see what's next. What's the next product that he continues to leverage this growing capability with? But Andy, I wanted to mention to you before we get off on sort of evolving the story. You mentioned Jeff Good. He's been on the show before. He's just a fascinating, very successful entrepreneur, and he cares deeply about the community and the restaurant community. And I enjoy telling his story. Robert St. John has been on this. He's a good friend, and he's been on the show so many times. He's a guy, you're going back to that quote that I read about Jim Henson about follow your enthusiasm. Robert St. John lives that. And it's in and of itself, it's a very, motivating story to understand where he comes from and his quest for sobriety and how he lives his life today. It's a pretty cool story. But anyway, coming back to your story. So you continued to expand and get into all this, from a food point of view, seeing sort of, what your role could be in all of that. What ultimately got you into pecans 10 years ago?
So one of the things that we started Eat Jackson. We grew out of Jackson because so many other towns said, hey, why don't you come to Birmingham or Baton Rouge or wherever? We have a great food scene. You should do a website here too. And we thought about that, but ended up doing a website called Eat Y'all that also, if you take that name internationally or outside of the South, people have no idea what that means. They're like, Eat Y'all? What is this? But it was a continuation of sharing food stories about great food. And led us to do a lot of events. And we did pop-up chef's table dinners all over the place with Eat Y'all. And it taught me to cook in a way that I'd never cooked before. And you can cook for 5 or 10 people at your house, but if you're cooking for 65 people and you're doing 6 courses and there's wine pairings and all the things, you've got to be at a different level. And so I'm standing next to some of the top chefs in the country doing these events and learning and watching and soaking it up. And so we would do these dinners, and people like Simmons Catfish would say, hey, it would be great if more chefs knew about our catfish. We'll sponsor part of the dinner. So what we would do a catfish dinner. During the oil spill, we did a lot of seafood dinners, and we used a lot of Mississippi seafood in these dinners. And so we did another event called the Sweetest Chefs of the South, which was a pastry chef competition. And some of the pecan industry said, oh, well, pastry chefs love pecans. They sponsored, and we started kind of figuring out how to help, because ultimately, somebody sponsors, they're not sponsoring just to see their logo. They want a result. They want to sell more products. And in fact, I was talking to a chef last week who has been using one of our products to the tune of we introduced him to somebody, I think he's probably spent $400,000 with the company that I introduced him to 8 years ago. So it was marketing, but through a relationship. And the pecan industry was really good to us. And I've always loved them. I used to go to piano lessons at Mississippi State, and there was a building that had pecan trees behind it. And there were several of us that took piano lessons. I'd never really turned out on that. We could talk about guitar later, but we would have to go out and pick up pecans in between your lesson and the next one. We'd fill up a grocery sack full of pecans off of campus. And so I've always had pecans as part of our life. When we had sponsors, I was like, oh, you don't have to crack these. You can just open a bag and they're beautiful, just like, fresh, great ones should be. And so we did events with them. And then the very first international event I ever did was in 2019. The Southern United States Trade Association said, hey, we think you should, well, actually, there's a coast tie-in to even why I'm doing that. It's this big trade group that promotes farms and agriculture products across, like from Louisiana over to Virginia, basically, is the Southern United States Trade Association. Paige Hunt called me and said, hey, we're meeting down on the coast. Is there a good place to go out to eat? And I said, well, how many people is it? Y'all could just come over to the house. And she ended up telling me that it was 50 or 30 or 40 or something. And Mariana, my wife, said, no, we're not doing that. And I said, why don't I do this? Let me get a couple of friends and we'll cook at the visitor center. And so I called 2 chefs and they said, absolutely, let's go. And so then I called some of the farms that were part of this trade organization, and we put on this huge dinner. And one of the representatives there was a company that is in India, and they said, why don't we do a dinner like this with all of these Southern farm products that you guys know, that are coming from your trade area in India, and why don't you come and do it? And I was like, no, I have no interest to go to India. And Mariana she was like, no, it'll be great. This will be fun. Let's do it. So 2019, I flew to India and I cooked our style food with basically a Michelin-starred chef in India with his 15 chefs in the kitchen, and I would show them, hey, this is what we're doing. I brought pecan wood in my suitcase, and we smoked chickens and turkeys that were from the U.S. We made pecan pies. We made a barbecue sauce and a rub that I'd been selling around the Southeast. We did sauces, and we did all sorts of things with all products from the U.S. and, in fact, the South. And I was blown away by the response. They'd never seen the pecan look like a golden, delicious pecan. They'd never tasted one that wasn't bitter. They were blown away by the smoke of the pecan wood on a chicken and a turkey. And so it really just kind of lit a fire. And everybody said, okay, well, how do I get these products? How do I get the pecans? And I told the trade representatives, hey, they want pecans. And they said, well, can they buy a full container, which is, 10 or 20 pallets, depending on what size. And they said, no, I need, 2 boxes twice a month or, whatever. And so I hadn't solved the problem, but I'd uncovered the problem. And that kind of led to, we got really good at that. Then COVID happened. So, and I'm not sure how long this segment is, Ricky, but when COVID happened, we had all these big plans. I was supposed to come back to India, do a whole nother thing at this awesome resort, and they were going to do it for their guests for like 6 days, and we were going to do pecans and smoke and have live fire grills, and I mean, it was an amazing opportunity. And then COVID happened. None of that happened, and our business got shut down because we did tons of travel and events with lots of people, and it was a pretty scary time dealing with all of that. But we started doing virtual trade missions because we knew how to work technology, and there were trade missions that were scheduled that we could take over, and I could film content with chefs and farms and go out there as an individual, pull all the content together, and then basically do a really great Zoom and have already pre-shipped products to people across the world, Taiwan, Mexico, Vietnam, so many different places. We did these trade missions, and they would have the product in their hand that we were talking about and showing them because of all the work we did before the actual trade mission kicked off. Sometimes we would be in the kitchen at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in our home kitchen with the ring light and the cell phone having one camera, the laptop having another one. I'm cooking, I'm making a paloma with citrus from Texas and showing these people stuff. And it's 2 or 3 in the morning. And I'm sure our neighbors thought we were crazy, but we stayed afloat, and we grew our business even through that time with all these different connections internationally in the food world.
Have you discovered, and we've got about a minute left in this segment, but have you discovered that the demand for the kind of pecans that you're selling to those, let's just stay with India for a second, that the demand is actually unlimited? Because we're talking about an enormous number of people in India.
There's 1.4 billion people in India. And if there's any farmers listening, I'm begging you, if you've got land and infrastructure, plant pecan trees, because I'm crushing every day creating demand. And buddy, the demand is unlimited. I mean, the 1% of India is amazingly, I mean, it's more wealthy than the top.
And we'll pick it up on the other side, but I would assume that the price is really relatively stable and high, such that doing pecan farming makes sense. So what we'll do when we come back on the other side, we only have like a segment left, but what we'll do is we'll sum it all up, tell you specifically about his business, and we'll get the quick story on where pecans do so well in America and how Ocean Springs ties into that. We'll see you when we get back with Andy Chapman. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting with Andy Chapman. He's the founder and CEO of Prime Pecan Feast Global, coming to us from India. But what's cool about this show, and we'll have him back, we'll continue these conversations, because what he's learned in his travels around the world is something we need to continue to sort of look into and learn more from. But it's a great story of entrepreneurship. How, it's so interesting. When you're an entrepreneur, you get to a fork in the road, go down the path least going down, and listen and learn opportunity and learn new skill sets, and then leverage that. And then it's like a snowball going down a hill. Your opportunities grow if you're open to them. And this is the cool thing about what ultimately took Andy to India. He's coming to us live from India as we speak. And when he learned about opportunity. So you ended up building this business. You can tell the quick story of Ocean Springs, but also, obviously, Mississippi can't provide what you need to fill it, to send 16,000 pounds in one shipment to a place like India. You're going to Texas and Georgia and places like that, but kind of give us a feel for that.
So the final chapter in how we got here, Ricky, was that So many of the chefs that I've seen many times internationally, and buyers that we'd been on trade missions said, okay, well, the pecans aren't looking like you're showing them to me. And so it kind of became a personal challenge. Like, how do we get that to happen? And so we created a company, created some not brand standards, but pecan farm standards, where we handle the pecans a certain way. We store them in a freezer so that they in the shell, so that if you pull a pecan out of your freezer 2 years later, you can put it right beside a fresh one, and your mom won't be able to tell the difference. I mean, it's that good. The way that God built the pecan nut with the little vac seal ridges around the meat. And so taking that fresh quality to people has really just blown the doors open. And we've been at trade shows all over the world doing this. And that then led to domestically chefs that we'd work with were like, hey, how do I get these pecans? And so we created a chef program here domestically. I mean, even if some of your listeners need a 30-pound box, that's how we do it. We'd love to share pecans with anybody who's a pecan lover. It's about that time of year. But we've had quite an adventure, man, just doing these things, and met so many amazing people who are all kind of, they're from all different parts of the world, but they love food and love sharing good products together.
Yeah. So, again, I keep mentioning Ocean Springs, but there is a historical aspect of Ocean Springs relative to the pecan. Yeah.
So we had the company for an entire year, and I was in the Delta meeting with some of Mississippi's farmers, and this guy said, you see that one right there? That's a desirable. You told me you're from the coast, right? And I said, yeah. He said, that pecan is from Ocean Springs, Mississippi. The tree is about 100 years old. And so we got on the internet, we came back and I started looking, and then I to our town historian, Ray, that everybody knows if you're in Ocean Springs. And we spent about 45 minutes on the phone, and he explained to me that not only the Stewart, the Desirable, but also the Schley, three of the most exported pecan varieties around the world came from Mississippi. And he sent me a flyer, and based on what was in that flyer, I started doing my own Google searches. And I'm telling you, I found an image of one of Ocean Springs pecan companies displaying at the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1833. And the history that we have, like our house is in an old orchard, like it's now a subdivision or neighborhood, but the pecan roots there's old pecan trees all over Ocean Springs. And some of them are even newer pecan trees, but they are some of the best varieties in the world. Of course, hurricanes have made it hard to keep pecan trees really viable right along the coast, but they were shipping pecans and pecan trees out to the world from Jackson County, Mississippi. And we found that out a year after we'd started the company. And it was kind of a God wink because...
Yeah, let me just say, go ahead and finish your point about God link. Yeah.
Well, there was kind of a God wink because I wasn't really, it wasn't on my bingo card to start a pecan company when I was getting out of college. But it was one of those things that was like, yep, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and go out there across the world and take these pecans to people.
There's no telling how many pecan trees were actually taken down to create farmland in the Mississippi Delta. I bet you if they had an opportunity to not do that now, they'd go back in time and change that course of history, because farming is tough in the Mississippi Delta these days. Listen, continue to do well. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. What a great story this is. And I look forward to actually, catching back up with you again sooner than later, just to continue the conversation about, what you're learning as you travel the world, the time that you're spending in India. Will you spend a couple of months there again this year, almost a couple of months?
So we'll probably come back for one more shorter trip with a product launch. And we're spending a lot of time in Europe. There's a lot of big trade shows over there. So we leave India, and when this is airing, I'll be on a plane to France and then Germany. So...
Well, see, there's a lot more to talk about, Andy. So I can't wait to continue the conversation. What a fascinating story. Congratulations, incidentally, on, kind of finding your entrepreneurial edge. And it will be interesting to see what's next, because you're finding new opportunities, I'm sure. You will find a way to leverage all
Absolutely.
that. This has been Andy Chapman from Prime Pecan Feast Global right here in Ocean Springs. Have a great day, Andy.
Thanks, Ricky.
Have a great day, everyone, and we will see you tomorrow.